The Dreidel 4 research station floated on the edge of the galaxy like a forgotten relic, hidden among rings of asteroids and cosmic dust. To most of the intergalactic species who roamed these sectors, Dreidel 4 was a peaceful outpost where researchers from different civilizations gathered to study and preserve the mysteries of the universe. But the peace was a facade, hanging by a thread. Inside the dimly lit control room, a small crew of alien officers watched as their ship glided through the vastness of space toward the isolated station. The Zern commander, a 7-foot-tall alien with scales that gleamed like polished metal, stood at the forefront, his 6 crimson eyes scanning the vastness of space. He was a formidable presence, muscular and shrouded in an armor that seemed to ripple with energy. Zern were known for their combat prowess and precision, their military strategies unmatched across galaxies. But this mission wasn't merely about precision, it was about a grave threat: humans. "We are nearing the Terran sector," he intoned, his voice as smooth as grinding stone, carrying authority that made his crew stiffen in response. "Remember, humans are not to be underestimated. They've been noted as apex predators, capable of surprising cunning." His lieutenant, a sharp-eyed creature with silvery tentacles extending from his shoulders, gave a respectful nod. "Commander Tava, we have prepared for every contingency, but it is still odd to hear of humans as predators. They are small, fragile, soft." Tava turned to him, eyes narrowing. "It's a mistake many have made." His mouth curled into something resembling a smirk as he recalled the reports. Countless species, lulled by the humans' lack of physical weaponry or size, had found themselves overwhelmed by their resilience and adaptability. But this mission wasn't simply to study, it was a test of the new alliance forged among the Quadrant League races to capture or neutralize a rogue human agent who had somehow outwitted entire fleets. As the Zern ship entered the station's atmosphere, Tava reviewed the holographic profile of the target. The human was identified only as Stone, a name that had become a curse among intergalactic spies. No one knew much about Stone's origins, but the tales of his exploits were enough to chill the bones of even the most hardened alien soldiers. "Whoever this Stone is," muttered Tava's lieutenant, "he will meet his end today." But the commander remained silent. His instincts told him that things were never that simple with humans. Meanwhile, on Dreidel 4, deep within the lab compounds, Stone lounged on a crate in the shadows, watching the Zern's landing on his small comm screen. A wry smile crept onto his face. He was a lean, wiry figure with keen eyes that missed nothing and a calm that often unnerved his adversaries. Stone knew this would happen eventually. You didn't disrupt intergalactic smuggling operations and dismantle espionage networks without attracting attention. He could almost hear the Zern's thoughts, the absolute assurance in their minds that they would simply overpower him with brute force. Little did they know that humans were experts at making big problems disappear with the smallest of actions. He stretched, took a deep breath, and checked his pockets: a handful of marbles, a stick of gum, and a length of wire, all seemingly innocuous but held the promise of much more in the right hands. "Here we go," he muttered to himself as he stood up and made his way through the dimly lit corridors of the station, his boots making barely a sound. The corridors of Dreidel 4 were eerily quiet, with only the hum of energy currents and the occasional hiss of steam escaping from vents. Alien researchers roamed the halls, most of them absorbed in their studies, oblivious to the Zern team approaching. Stone blended into the shadows, making his way to a maintenance bay he'd scoped out earlier. He had a plan, but it depended entirely on the Zern commander making a few critical errors he could nudge into being. Just as he slipped into the bay, a blaring alarm echoed throughout the station. The announcement system crackled to life, followed by a cold, authoritative voice. "Attention, all occupants of Dreidel 4. This is Commander Tava of the Zern Galactic Legion. Cooperate, and no harm will come to you. We are here to apprehend a rogue operative. All inhabitants are ordered to remain in their quarters until further notice." Stone couldn't help but chuckle. They were putting on quite the show, weren't they? As the Zern team made their way through the station's corridors, they encountered little resistance, most of the inhabitants opting to lock themselves away in their rooms. But Stone was watching, studying their every move through a series of surveillance cameras he'd tapped into. They moved with precision, each member synced with the next, like a machine designed for one purpose: capturing him. But they were making a classic mistake. one he'd seen before in dozens of operations. They underestimated the station's layout. The Drade Alpha station wasn't like any Zern military facility or the sterile labs that most aliens were used to. It was a patchwork of different designs and additions, cobbled together by researchers from various species over decades. There were traps, dead ends, and corridors that twisted back on themselves. In short, it was a nightmare to navigate unless you had an intimate knowledge of its structure, something Stone had spent months memorizing. The Zern team split up to cover more ground, each group heading down a different corridor. Tava led one team, his lieutenant another. As Stone watched, he noted each team's movements, adjusting his plans accordingly. He was planning on evasion, perhaps throwing them off course with some harmless distractions. But as he looked closer at Tava's team on the camera feed, he noticed something odd, an array of drones being released from their packs. Each was outfitted with advanced sensor arrays, scouring every inch of the corridors as they moved. "Ah, you came prepared," Stone murmured, intrigued. "So you're not as overconfident as you look." For a moment, he considered making a quick escape, avoiding the confrontation altogether. But then he remembered his mission. Drade Alpha held research data he couldn't let fall into the Zern's hands. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about protecting information that could tilt the balance of power in this sector. The Zern couldn't be allowed to access it. He'd have to disable the station's data hub, but he'd have to do it without leading the Zern directly to him. With a wry smile, he reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the marbles. It wasn't just a toy, he'd rigged it with a small EMP burst, just enough to knock out a drone or two. "Let's give you something to chase." Minutes later, the Zern's drones picked up a faint signal moving through the station. Tava's team converged on the location, weapons drawn, ready to apprehend their target. But as they rounded a corner, they found only an empty corridor, with a small, innocent-looking marble rolling to a stop in front of them. "Is this some kind of joke?" one of Tava's soldiers growled, staring down at the marble in disbelief. Tava bent down, his crimson eyes narrowing as he studied it. He didn't recognize the object's purpose, but he knew better than to take it lightly. He motioned for his team to back away, just in time. The marble emitted a faint beep before a flash of light burst from it, followed by a low hum. The EMP pulse swept through the corridor, and two of the nearby drones dropped out of the air, their circuits fried. "Clever," Tava muttered, not without a trace of admiration. "He's leading us on a chase." A tense silence filled the corridor as the team reassembled, regaining their composure. Stone was testing them, probing their weaknesses and assessing their tactics. The Zern soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, they seemed to realize that their prey was no ordinary human. Stone wasn't running blindly, he was leading them, controlling the game from the shadows. Tava's respect for his target grew. This was no mere rogue agent, but a strategist. The commander's eyes gleamed with excitement, he hadn't had a challenge like this in years. "Stay focused," he ordered, his voice firm. "He's trying to buy time. Keep the drones ahead of us. We'll track him down, piece by piece if we have to." Meanwhile, Stone was already moving again, setting up his next trick in another corridor. He knew he was outnumbered and outgunned, but that wasn't new to him. His strength lay in his unpredictability. He'd never won a battle on brute force, he won on audacity and out-of-the-box tactics. As he crouched in a narrow passageway, he could hear the distant footsteps of the Zern team. He knew he couldn't keep this game up forever, sooner or later, they'd catch on. But if he could disable a few more drones, lead them on a longer chase, and buy himself just enough time. In his earpiece, he picked up a faint signal, the station's old security network, an archaic system barely held together with duct tape and wishes. It was an unreliable ally, but one that could buy him a precious few seconds if he could access it remotely. But for that, he'd need a way to get the Zern to keep chasing the decoys. He had to make them think he was desperate, close, just a few steps away. A plan began to form, half-baked but wild enough that it might just work. And as he readied himself to lead the Zern on another wild chase through the station, he couldn't help but grin. As Commander Tava's team advanced through the labyrinthine corridors of Drade L4, the atmosphere grew thicker with tension. The station seemed to have a life of its own, doors and vents hissing open and shut as if guiding them somewhere. In a way, it was. Stone was in control, leading them deeper into the maze-like structure he knew so well. Every flickering light, every sudden noise became a cue in the elaborate dance he orchestrated to keep the Zerg at bay. Tava was beginning to sense the subtle shift in their hunt. They were no longer the pursuers but the pursued. Stone's moves weren't random distractions, they were deliberate, designed to nudge them into corners and narrow passageways. He was toying with them, and Tava was beginning to feel the frustration growing within his team. "Commander," his lieutenant reported, the metallic tone in his voice laced with irritation. "We've lost 2 more drones. This human is wasting our resources. At this rate, we'll have nothing left to capture him with." "Patience," Tava replied, his voice sharp. "He's revealing his patterns. Every move tells us something about him. We will use his own tactics against him." But as the Zerg continued their pursuit, Stone was already onto his next maneuver. He had moved to a more secure part of the station, one with a narrow vent system that connected to multiple levels. He knew it like the back of his hand, each twist and turn a calculated step in his grand escape plan. Crouching beside the console in one of the central maintenance rooms, he tapped into the station's emergency network, breathing life into ancient protocols. The security system sputtered to life, activating a series of alarms that echoed throughout the corridors. Red lights flashed along the ceiling, and a synthesized voice droned from the speakers. "Warning, containment breach detected. All personnel, please proceed to the nearest safe zone." The announcement had the desired effect. The Zerg team stopped in their tracks, momentarily disoriented by the flashing lights and blaring alarms. Tava clenched his fists, recognizing the tactic but unwilling to yield. "Stay focused," he barked. "This is his doing. Ignore the alarms, he's using them to throw us off balance." But Stone wasn't counting on the alarms to stop them, he was counting on their distrust of the environment to slow them down. With the Zerg distracted by the false warning, he darted through a side passage and ducked into a storage area, quickly rigging a few devices to leave a trail. He wasn't simply leading them, he was painting a picture, crafting a breadcrumb trail to lead them to a specific part of the station. As he left the storage area, he paused, glancing down at a small black box with a faint, blinking red light. He knew the Zerg would find it soon enough, and when they did, they would interpret it as evidence that he was planting explosives. But the box was harmless, a simple tool for diagnostics that he'd reprogrammed to emit a distress signal. He grinned, knowing the Zerg would take it seriously and would soon be scrambling to neutralize a non-existent threat. The Zerg team arrived at the storage room minutes later, tense and ready for an ambush. Tava's lieutenant was the first to spot the black box, his eyes narrowing as he examined it. "Commander, he's setting traps. This looks like an explosive device." "Disarm it," Tava ordered, but as he inspected the device himself, he noticed something odd. There were no visible detonation mechanisms. He couldn't be sure, but something about it seemed off, almost playful. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. Stone wasn't trying to destroy them, he was mocking them, playing a game where every move was designed to make them waste time and resources. His eyes flashed with irritation. He never encountered a human who could so thoroughly dismantle his team's confidence, and this mere fact only heightened his resolve to capture Stone alive. This human was too dangerous to be left free, too cunning to underestimate. As Stone continued through the station, he picked up his pace, aware that the Zerg's patience was running thin. He'd have to execute the next part of his plan carefully. This was where he'd test the limits of their tolerance. His goal was simple: break down the cohesion of their team by forcing them into smaller, isolated groups. And he knew just how to do it. He sprinted down the corridors, darting between shadows and empty passageways until he reached the station's lower levels. These areas were less traveled, filled with old, rusty pipes and storage units no one had used in years. It was the perfect place to disappear. Using a small transmitter, he activated a signal that jammed the Zerg's internal communications. Their earpieces crackled and fizzed, leaving each team member stranded, unable to relay information or receive instructions. Isolated from each other, they would be more vulnerable to the station's twists and turns, and Stone's clever misdirections. Tava was the first to realize something was wrong. He tapped his communicator, only to hear static. A sense of unease gnawed at him. The human was exploiting every weakness, isolating them, turning their own advanced tech against them. With their communications severed, his team was vulnerable to ambush, but he had to keep them moving. Stay together, he commanded his nearest soldiers, though he couldn't be certain they were even receiving his instructions. They moved forward cautiously, checking every corner, their fingers tight on their weapons. And that's when Stone made his next move. A loud, metallic crash echoed down the corridor behind them. Tava's soldiers spun around, raising their weapons, eyes scanning the shadows. They fired instinctively, the corridor lighting up with flashes of energy, but all they hit was an overturned storage crate that clattered as it rolled down the hall. "Hold your fire!" Tava snarled, realizing Stone had set them up again. But his team's nerves were frayed, each soldier on edge, their fingers twitching on the triggers. It was a perfect example of human psychology at work, how quickly fear could erode discipline when the mind couldn't see beyond the shadows. While they hesitated, Stone moved into position. He had managed to slip into an air duct above them, watching their every move through the grate. With a quiet chuckle, he pulled out another one of his tricks, a small device programmed to emit his biometric signature, a trick he'd picked up in his years of intelligence work. He tossed the device out of the duct and into the next corridor, where it began to emit a faint pulse, mimicking his vital signs. The Zern scanners would pick it up as if he were just a few meters away. And they did. "Commander, his signal's coming from the next passageway," one of the soldiers shouted, relief evident in his voice. They had him. Tava's eyes gleamed. "Move in. Carefully." As they entered the passageway, Stone watched from above, grinning as they closed in on nothing. They were wasting precious energy on ghosts, while he slipped further away, inch by inch. But Stone knew he couldn't keep this up indefinitely. With every trick, every diversion, he was depleting his limited resources. And the Zern weren't fools. Sooner or later, they'd figure out his strategy and tighten the net. It was time for the final phase of his plan, a phase that depended on pushing Tava past the breaking point. He moved quickly to the station's main reactor core, where the research data he'd come for was stored. It was housed within an older console, its digital locks easy enough to hack given the time, but time was precisely what he didn't have. He only needed a few moments to extract the data, and for that, he had to create a diversion that would make the Zern hesitate, if only for a few minutes. Using his wire and dumb, he rigged a small device to emit false signals around the reactor. It wasn't much, but it would create a sensor pattern that would look like multiple targets moving in different directions. It would confuse their scanners, splitting their attention. As the Zern team approached the reactor room, their scanners picked up movement from every direction. Tava's face twisted with irritation as he watched the feeds. Stone had multiplied, his signal bouncing across the room in every direction. They were surrounded by a maze of phantom targets. "Enough." Tava snarled, slamming his fist against the wall. "You think you're clever, human? This ends now." In that moment, Tava made a critical error. He ordered his team to move in, splitting them into smaller groups to follow each signal. It was exactly what Stone had wanted. Hidden in the shadows behind a console, Stone watched as the Zern scattered, each soldier chasing a different target. He slipped out, darting through the reactor room's maze-like structure, moving with a speed and stealth that seemed impossible. He could see Tava on the far side of the room, barking orders at his disoriented team. Stone smiled. He had one more ace up his sleeve. With a flick of his wrist, he activated a small device on his belt, a pulse generator. It released a field that disrupted the reactor room's electronics for a brief moment, just long enough for the lights to flicker and the sensors to go dark. In the confusion, Stone made his way to the console, connecting his data drive and downloading the research data. As the lights returned, Tava caught sight of him, their eyes locking for a fraction of a second. Stone gave a casual salute, smirking as the data completed its download. And with that, he darted toward the maintenance hatch, leaving Tava and his soldiers scrambling in frustration. After him. Tava roared, but it was too late. Stone had disappeared into the shadows once again, the precious data in hand. The game was nearing its end, and he had one last move to make. Stone sprinted through the maze of Dreidel 4's lower levels, the downloaded data secured in his pocket. The Zerg were closing in. He could hear the echoing clanks of their heavy boots as they charged through the corridors behind him, rage fueling their relentless pursuit. They had lost too much time and too many resources to let him escape now. He rounded a corner and entered an old maintenance bay filled with discarded equipment and rusted pipes. It was an enclosed space, hardly ideal for evasion, but it was all he had. He scanned his surroundings quickly, assessing his options. He couldn't keep running forever, not with his limited stamina and the Zerg's relentless determination. This would be his last stand. If he wanted to make it out alive, he had to face them here and now. Stone took a deep breath, steadied his heartbeat and mentally counted his remaining tools. He had only 2 marbles left, each equipped with a small EMP charge, a spool of thin wire, and his trusty comlink. Not much, but he'd worked with less. He took a moment to set up his surroundings, positioning the EMP marbles near the entrance, just out of sight, and rigging the thin wire across the floor. As he worked, he muttered to himself, "Come on, Stone, this is nothing you haven't done before. Just keep them guessing." He could hear the Zerg drawing closer, their voices growing louder as they communicated with each other, coordinating their approach. It wouldn't be long before they breached the maintenance bay. Stone finished setting up his traps and ducked behind an old generator, steadying his breathing as he waited. Commander Tava led the charge, his eyes narrowed with determination. His team had been stretched to the breaking point, scattered and disoriented by Stone's relentless tricks and decoys, but he had managed to regroup them for this final assault. They moved forward in silence, each soldier gripping their weapon tightly, their eyes scanning every shadow. "Keep your eyes sharp," Tava ordered in a low voice. "He's not going to surrender willingly." They moved carefully, weapons raised, but as they crossed the threshold into the maintenance bay, Tava felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. Something was wrong. Stone's tricks had been clever but relatively harmless until now, and the Zerg commander couldn't shake the feeling that this last stand would be different. More dangerous. The first Zerg soldier stepped over the thin wire Stone had rigged. It triggered the EMP marbles he'd placed, and a burst of static filled the air. The lights flickered, and the Zerg's weapons crackled as the EMP wave washed over them, temporarily disabling their systems. 2 of the soldiers stumbled back, cursing as their targeting systems rebooted. Stone seized the opportunity, leaping out from behind the generator and charging toward the nearest soldier. In one fluid motion, he tackled the alien to the ground, disarming him and using his own weapon to fire a few shots at the remaining Zerg. The blasts echoed through the maintenance bay, but Stone didn't have time to celebrate his success. The Zerg soldiers were already recovering, their weapons coming back online. Tava roared, "Enough games, human. Surrender, and I might consider letting you live." Stone laughed, panting as he ducked behind another console. "You really think that's an option?" he called out. "I didn't come this far to just give up." Tava's eyes narrowed. This human was more dangerous than he'd anticipated, more cunning and relentless. The commander motioned for his team to spread out, each soldier advancing carefully, inching closer to where Stone had taken cover. "Do you know why we're after you, Stone?" Tava's voice was calm but laced with barely concealed frustration. "You're a threat to the stability of this sector. Your kind has no business meddling in the affairs of the Quadrant League." Stone smirked, his eyes gleaming with defiance. "Maybe that's the problem. Maybe your league has no business messing with humanity." Tava clenched his fists. The human's arrogance was infuriating, but he couldn't deny the thrill of the chase, the exhilaration of facing an enemy as skilled and unorthodox as Stone. It had been years since he'd encountered such a formidable opponent. But now, as his soldiers closed in, he was ready to end it. "Enough talking," Tava said, his voice low and menacing. "It's time to finish this." Stone glanced around, his mind racing as he calculated his options. He had one last idea, one last chance to turn the tide. He pulled out his comlink and activated the emergency frequency he'd hacked into earlier. It was a risky move, one that would draw every security alert on Dreidel directly to his location, but he was out of options. He took a deep breath and transmitted a single message. Security breach in maintenance bay. All personnel, prepare for lockdown. The automated system responded instantly, the blaring alarm echoing through the corridors as the station went into lockdown. Heavy metal doors slammed shut, sealing off the maintenance bay from the rest of the station. The Zern soldiers looked around in confusion, momentarily thrown off by the sudden lockdown. Stone took advantage of their distraction, leaping out from his hiding place and firing the stolen Zern weapon in rapid succession. The energy blasts ricocheted off the walls, forcing the soldiers to dive for cover. In the chaos, Stone ducked behind another console, catching his breath as he watched Tava regroup his soldiers, his frustration palpable. "This is your last chance, Stone," Tava growled, his voice filled with anger. "You're trapped. There's nowhere left to run." Stone grinned, wiping sweat from his brow. "Maybe I'm not the one who's trapped, Commander." Tava's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting as he began to understand Stone's plan. The lockdown had isolated them, trapping them inside the maintenance bay. Stone had used the station's own security protocols to turn the bay into a fortress, and now, the Zern soldiers were caught inside with him, cut off from reinforcements. "Clever," Tava muttered, grudgingly impressed. "But cleverness won't save you, human." The commander advanced, his weapon raised, but Stone wasn't finished yet. He took a deep breath, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his last remaining marble. It was a standard EMP charge, but he'd rigged it to deliver a delayed burst, buying him a few precious seconds to make his move. As Tava and his soldiers closed in, Stone hurled the marble across the floor. It skittered to a stop near Tava's feet, and the commander's eyes widened in recognition. He barked a command to his team, but it was too late. The EMP burst erupted, knocking out their weapons once more, plunging the maintenance bay into chaos. In the confusion, Stone made his move. He charged toward Tava, tackling him with all his strength, knocking the commander off balance. They grappled, their movements a blur of punches and shoves, each trying to gain the upper hand. Tava was strong, his alien physiology giving him a clear advantage in brute force, but Stone was faster, his movements precise and calculated. He dodged Tava's strikes, countering with quick jabs that left the commander reeling. For a moment, it seemed as if Stone might actually win, his relentless determination overpowering Tava's strength. But Tava was not so easily defeated. With a snarl, he broke free of Stone's grip, slamming the human against the wall with bone-jarring force. Stone gasped, the impact leaving him momentarily stunned, but he refused to back down. He shoved Tava away, his gaze steely with resolve. "This ends now," Tava growled, raising his weapon as it powered back online. Stone's eyes narrowed. He had one last trick up his sleeve, a final gambit that he'd been saving for this exact moment. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sleek device, a sonic disruptor he'd stolen from one of the Zern drones earlier. Without hesitation, he activated the disruptor, unleashing a high-frequency blast that reverberated through the maintenance bay. The Zern soldiers clutched their ears, their senses overwhelmed by the piercing sound. Even Tava staggered, momentarily disoriented by the sonic assault. Stone took his chance, lunging forward and disarming Tava with a swift, practiced motion. He aimed the commander's own weapon at him, his finger hovering over the trigger. For a long, tense moment, they stood there, locked in a silent standoff. Tava's eyes were filled with fury, but also a grudging respect. He knew he'd been bested, outmaneuvered by a mere human who had turned every disadvantage into an advantage. "You may have won this time," Tava said through gritted teeth. "But this isn't over, Stone. The Quadrant League will come for you. We will hunt you down, wherever you go." Stone smirked, lowering the weapon slightly. "Maybe. But for now, it looks like I have the upper hand." He took a step back, still holding the weapon trained on Tava, his gaze unwavering. "Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to call off your soldiers, and you're going to let me walk out of here. Otherwise, I'm going to make sure this little encounter ends very badly for all of us." Tava glared at him, clearly reluctant to concede defeat, but he knew he had no choice. With a low growl, he raised his hand, signaling his soldiers to stand down. Stone nodded, satisfied. He backed toward the maintenance bay door, keeping his weapon trained on Tava until he was safely out of reach. As he slipped through the door, he cast one last glance at the commander, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. "See you around, Commander. Next time, maybe don't underestimate a human." And with that, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Tava and his soldiers behind, humiliated and defeated. Stone moved swiftly through the deserted corridors of Dreydal 4, the sounds of the Zern soldiers fading behind him. He'd bought himself a narrow window of opportunity to escape, but he knew it wouldn't last long. The Zern would soon be regrouping, Tava would be rallying his forces, and the station's security system would be overridden to track him down. Clutching the data drive in his pocket, Stone navigated the winding corridors toward his final destination, the shuttle bay. The only way out of Dreydal 4 was an unregistered escape pod stashed in an auxiliary hangar at the far edge of the station. He'd planted it there weeks ago in anticipation of something going sideways. After all, in his line of work, a contingency plan was as essential as breathing. As he crept closer to the shuttle bay, Stone activated his comlink, attempting to reach his extraction contact, a gruff pilot named Race who had worked with him on various covert missions over the years. The link burst for a few seconds before connecting, and Race's familiar voice crackled through. "Stone, you're cutting it close." "I got Zern warships patrolling nearby," Race growled, his tone tinged with a mix of concern and impatience. "Just get ready to pick me up." "I'll be out in 5 minutes, tops," Stone replied, breathing heavily as he checked the hallways around him. "And if they catch wind of you, feel free to blast out of there. I'll figure something else out." Race chuckled, a grin sound that hinted at years of dangerous missions. "Not a chance. I've got a reputation to uphold, and you're not ruining it. But hurry up. I'm not planning on playing cat and mouse with Zern warships for long." Stone smiled, grateful for his friend's loyalty. He ended the call and pressed onward, slipping through the final corridor and entering the shuttle bay. The area was vast and dimly lit, filled with maintenance shuttles and outdated cargo haulers. His eyes scanned the space, looking for any sign of Zern soldiers. The coast was clear, for now. He made his way to the small, inconspicuous escape pod he'd hidden among the crates. The pod was a beaten-up model, barely spaceworthy, but it was fitted with a cloaking device that would get him past the station's sensors. He quickly climbed inside, sealing the hatch and running through the launch protocols. The engine hummed to life, and the pod's navigation screen blinked, ready to guide him away from Dreydal 4. As he initiated the launch sequence, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The data drive he'd secured held invaluable research that could shift the balance of power in this sector. It was information that the Quadrant League, with all its political might and military prowess, could not be allowed to control unchecked. They'd been operating without accountability, and he had finally found a way to expose their secrets. But it wasn't just about the data anymore, it was about sending a message. The pod's navigation panel beeped, signaling the launch sequence was complete. Stone braced himself as the pod jolted, rocketing out of the shuttle bay and into the cold expanse of space. Within seconds, the cloaking device activated, and the stars around him shimmered as the pod became undetectable. He was out. But his relief was short-lived. As he drifted through space, he spotted 2 Zern warships cruising nearby, their sleek hulls gleaming ominously against the backdrop of stars. They hadn't detected him yet, but they were close, too close. He felt his pulse quicken. If they managed to spot the pod, he wouldn't stand a chance. In a calculated risk, he adjusted the pod's trajectory, veering slightly to the left to avoid crossing their patrol route. His hands gripped the controls tightly, hoping the pod's cloaking device would hold. Every second felt like an eternity as he glided past the Zern ships, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, he cleared their range, breathing a sigh of relief. He keyed in Race's coordinates, sending a quick signal to his friend's ship. Moments later, Race's familiar freighter appeared on his scanner, a sturdy vessel painted with the scars of countless battles. The freighter's hatch opened, and Stone guided the pod inside, docking with a soft thud. As he climbed out, Race was there to greet him, a crooked grin on his face. "You look worse than I expected," Race remarked, clapping him on the shoulder. Long story, Stone replied, managing a tired smile. But I've got what we came for. Race's eyes widened as he spotted the data drive Stone held up. So it's true, then? The League's research station really was hiding something big. Bigger than we imagined, Stone confirmed. But this isn't over. The Zern commander I tangled with isn't the kind to let something like this slide. He'll come after us, after this data. We need to act fast. Race nodded, guiding Stone to the cockpit. Then let's make sure they never catch up. I've got coordinates to a safe zone on the outer rim. We can lie low there while you figure out your next move. As they set course for the outer rim, Stone leaned back in his seat, exhaustion catching up to him. He closed his eyes, replaying the events of the last few hours in his mind. The chase, the traps, the final standoff with Commander Tava, it all seemed surreal, yet it had all been necessary to secure the information in his possession. A part of him felt a grim satisfaction. He'd managed to outwit the Zern, defy the odds, and accomplish his mission. But he knew this victory was only temporary. The Quadrant League wouldn't stop hunting him. They couldn't afford to let someone like him, someone who knew their secrets, remain free. For now, though, he was alive, and he had the data. That was enough. Race broke the silence, glancing at Stone with a wry smile. You know, I always thought those stories about humans being apex predators were exaggerations. But after this, you might have me convinced. Stone laughed, a genuine, relieved laugh that released the tension still coiled within him. Predators? Maybe not. Survivors? Definitely. They flew through space in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Stone knew he'd need allies if he was going to stand a chance against the League. This data would only be powerful if it reached the right hands, those willing to resist the League's influence and expose the truth. It was a daunting task, but he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a fire that would not be easily extinguished. Several days later, in a secure outpost hidden on the edge of the galaxy, Stone reviewed the data he had risked everything to retrieve. The information was staggering: plans, blueprints, and experiment logs detailing the League's efforts to manipulate interstellar resources, control entire planetary systems, and enforce compliance through hidden agents embedded across the galaxy. With this data, he could not only bring attention to the League's ruthless ambitions but rally those who would resist them. He envisioned a coalition, an alliance of species that would stand against the League's unchecked power. And then there was the memory of Tava. Stone had no doubt the Zern commander was out there, plotting his next move, preparing his forces. Their paths would cross again, of that, he was certain. But this time, he'd be ready. Stone took a deep breath, steeling himself. He knew the road ahead would be dangerous, that he was stepping into a war of ideologies and power that would test him to his limits. But he also knew that this was bigger than him. It was about protecting freedom, ensuring that no single power could control the galaxy's destiny. With a final glance at the data, he began transmitting the files to the first of his trusted contacts. His message was clear: the League's secrets were out, and there was a new player in the game, one who wouldn't back down. As he finished the transmission, he leaned back, a fierce determination in his gaze. The hunt would resume soon enough, and he would be ready. Somewhere out there, Commander Tava and the Quadrant League were waiting, but this time they wouldn't be facing a lone human. They'd be facing the spark of a resistance, one that would make them realize, once and for all, that humans were more than just prey. They were survivors. And they weren't alone.